Welcome back to the Ghastly Journal, where we uncover the darkest stories hidden in the shadows. Today, we delve into the forgotten hollows of Colorado's mining country, where the earth itself seems to breathe with ancient secrets. In the year 1903, the town of Silverthorne, nestled in the craggy embrace of the Rocky Mountains, was experiencing the waning days of the great mining boom. The snow-capped peaks stood sentinel over valleys where prosperity had begun its slow retreat, leaving behind the skeletal remnants of ambition, abandoned shafts, decaying outbuildings, and the hollow eyes of empty miners' cabins. The Dwyer family mine had once been the pride of Augustus Dwyer, a man whose fervor for silver extraction was matched only by his devotion to his 5 children. The mine shaft, carved like a wound into the mountain's flank, descended nearly 800 feet into darkness, following a vein of silver that had glimmered with promise in the lantern light. But as with many such enterprises in the region, the promise had faded, the silver had thinned, and by the turn of the century, operations had ceased. The entrance to the mine stood like a gaping maw amid a copse of aspen trees whose leaves trembled perpetually, as if in fear of what lay beyond the rotting timber supports. A weathered sign, its paint flaked away by mountain winters, still bore the barely legible warning, "Dwyer Silver, no trespassing." The wooden platform before the entrance had warped and splintered, nature already beginning its slow reclamation of man's brief intrusion. It was on the 15th of October when young Thomas Fletcher first went missing. A boy of merely 9 years, with copper hair and a constellation of freckles across his nose, he had been last seen collecting pine cones at the edge of town. By nightfall, when the mountain air grew knife-sharp with cold, his mother's cries echoed through Silverthorne's streets. Within a fortnight, 3 more children had vanished. The Abernathy twins, Elizabeth and Edward, both 12, disappeared while returning from the schoolhouse, and little Margaret Collins, only 7, seemingly evaporated from her own garden while her mother hung laundry mere yards away. The town descended into a miasma of fear. Doors were bolted at dusk, children kept indoors, and suspicious eyes turned upon strangers passing through. Sheriff Holloway organized search parties that combed the forests and hillsides, their lanterns moving like fireflies against the darkened landscape, their calls swallowed by the vastness of the wilderness. No one thought to search the abandoned Dwyer mine until Ezekiel Hayes, the town drunk whose nights were spent in inebriated slumber behind the saloon, reported seeing lights dancing deep within the mine shaft during his nightly stumble home. Like little stars, he had slurred, moving about where no stars ought to be. His words might have been dismissed as the ramblings of a man whose mind had been pickled in whiskey, were it not for the sudden appearance of Augustus Dwyer himself, returning to Silverthorne after 3 years' absence. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow pools of dread, and he spoke but one sentence upon his arrival: "They've woken what sleeps in the deep." What followed would etch itself into the nightmares of Silverthorne for generations to come, a tale of children found alive yet irrevocably changed, and of horrors that should have remained buried in the lightless chambers beneath the mountain. Sheriff Holloway initially dismissed Augustus Dwyer's cryptic warning as the ravings of a man driven to madness by grief. After the mine's closure, rumors had circulated through Silverthorne that Dwyer had lost his wife to consumption the previous winter, and his return, haggard and wild-eyed, seemed to confirm that sorrow had unhinged his mind. Yet there was something in his voice, a tremulous certainty, that prompted the sheriff to organize an expedition to the abandoned shaft the following morning. Dawn broke reluctantly over the mountains, the October sun struggling to penetrate a pewter sky heavy with the promise of early snow. A contingent of 12 men assembled before the saloon, armed with pickaxes, lanterns, and Winchester rifles. Among them stood Augustus Dwyer, who had not slept, his eyes fixed upon the distant silhouette of the mine that bore his name. "My grandfather warned me," he muttered as they trudged through frosted underbrush, their breath plumbing before them in the biting cold. "Said the Ute would never dig there. Said they called it the place where the earth speaks in whispers." The miners in the group exchanged wary glances. Such tales were common in mining country, indigenous warnings recast as superstition by men eager to claim the riches beneath tribal lands. Yet the disappearance of 4 children lent Dwyer's words an unsettling gravity. As they approached the mine entrance, Reverend Thaddeus Blackwell, who had insisted on accompanying the search party, remarked upon the peculiar absence of wildlife. "No birdsong," he observed, his scholarly voice incongruous against the primal landscape. "No squirrels nor rabbits. Nature herself seems to have abandoned this place." The warped timbers of the entrance emitted a faint groan as the men stepped onto the platform. Beneath the weathered sign, someone had carved strange symbols into the wood, curvilinear shapes that appeared to flow into one another like water. Dwyer's face blanched at the sight. "My youngest, Abigail, began drawing these before I shuttered the mine," he whispered. "Said she'd dreamed them." Sheriff Holloway, a practical man whose faith resided firmly in what could be seen and touched, ordered lanterns lit and weapons checked before leading the descent. The shaft's initial gradient was gentle, reinforced with timber supports that had held despite 3 years of abandonment. The air grew dense as they proceeded, carrying the mineral tang of wet stone and something else, a cloying sweetness reminiscent of overripe fruit. At 300 feet below the surface, the main tunnel intersected with a lateral passage not marked on the survey maps Dwyer had brought. The walls here glistened with moisture that reflected their lamplight in iridescent patterns, almost hypnotic in their fluid movement. "This wasn't here," Dwyer insisted, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "We never dug this direction." Yet the passage showed signs of human presence, recent presence. A child's shoe, unmistakably belonging to little Margaret Collins, lay discarded at the tunnel mouth. Further within, small footprints disturbed the fine silt coating the floor. Most disturbing, however, were the drawings that adorned the tunnel walls, crude renderings in what appeared to be coal dust mixed with saliva. They depicted tall, attenuated figures surrounding smaller ones, their limbs impossibly elongated, their heads mere suggestions of form. Interspersed among these were the same flowing symbols that had been carved above the mine entrance. "My God," breathed Reverend Blackwell, raising his lantern higher. "These markings, they're reminiscent of those found in certain pre-Columbian ceremonial chambers, symbols of transcendence or transformation." Sheriff Holloway silenced him with a raised hand. From deep within the unexplained tunnel came the sound that would haunt the search party's dreams for years to come. Children's laughter, distorted by distance and the peculiar acoustics of the shaft, underscored by a rhythmic scraping, as of bone against stone. The search party hesitated at the threshold of that aberrant tunnel, each man caught in his own private moment of dread. Jacob Thorne, the blacksmith whose powerful shoulders had long served as both metaphor and reality of Silverthorn's strength, visibly trembled. His calloused hands, capable of bending iron to his will, now clutched his lantern with white-knuckled terror. "I'll not go further," he announced, his baritone voice uncharacteristically high. "There's something unnatural here." Augustus Dwyer turned toward him, his once handsome face now a topographic map of sorrows. The skin beneath his eyes hung in bruised crescents, and the lines around his mouth had deepened to crevasses. His chestnut hair, prematurely threaded with silver, hung limp against his hollow cheeks. "The children, man," Dwyer whispered. "Can you not hear them?" Indeed, the laughter continued, punctuated now by what sounded like singing, a lilting, wordless melody that seemed to rise and fall in patterns that defied conventional musical structure. Sheriff Holloway, whose weathered face remained impassive despite the cold sweat beading beneath his mustache, motioned the party forward. "Stay together," he commanded, "and for God's sake, keep your wits." 20 yards into the unexplained passage, they discovered the first evidence of habitation. A small alcove had been hollowed into the rock, lined with aspen leaves and pine boughs arranged with deliberate care. Scattered about were personal effects recognizable as belonging to the missing children. Thomas Fletcher's wooden spinning top, Margaret Collins' hair ribbon, a slate pencil used by one of the Abernathy twins. "They've made a nest," observed Jeremiah Powell, the town physician, whose analytical mind struggled to reconcile what his eyes perceived. A slender man with spectacles that caught the lamplight, Powell had delivered each of the missing children and now moved with clinical precision to examine the alcove. But why here? How could they survive? The answer came as they rounded a bend in the tunnel. where it widened suddenly into a chamber of such peculiar geometry that several men instinctively stepped back. The ceiling arched overhead in curves that seemed to follow no structural necessity. The walls, rather than meeting at right angles, flowed into one another in ways that confused the eye and disoriented the senses. In the center of this chamber, illuminated by phosphorescent fungi that clung to the walls and cast an otherworldly blue-green light, sat the four missing children. They formed a perfect circle, holding hands, their faces upturned toward the irregular ceiling. Their clothing hung in tatters, but their skin appeared unmarked, even radiant in the fungal glow. Most shocking was their physical transformation. Though missing only weeks, each child appeared to have grown several inches, their limbs elongated in proportions that approached the disturbing figures in their drawings. Their eyes, when they finally turned toward the search party, reflected the phosphorescent light like those of nocturnal creatures. "Hello, Papa," said Abigail Dwyer, rising from behind the circle of children with fluid grace. Her father collapsed to his knees, a guttural sound escaping his throat. The girl, not seen in Silverthorne for 3 years and presumed to have accompanied her father in his departure, now stood before them, a child of perhaps 12 whose stature suggested 16, whose movements suggested something far older still. "We've been waiting," she continued, her voice containing harmonics that made the lantern flames waver. "They told us you would come when we had gathered enough." "Gathered enough?" Sheriff Holloway managed to say, his voice catching like fabric on a nail. His Winchester hung uselessly at his side, its metal cold against his palm. Abigail tilted her head at an angle that seemed to defy the natural articulation of the human neck. Her once golden hair had darkened to the color of wet earth, hanging in rope-like tendrils that reached well past her waist. When she smiled, her teeth appeared faintly luminescent, like the fungi clinging to the chamber walls. "Enough witnesses," she replied with childlike simplicity. "Enough eyes to see what grows beneath." The four missing children remained seated, their hands interlocked in their perfect circle, but their heads had turned in unison to observe the search party. Their eyes blinked at oddly spaced intervals, never synchronizing, creating a disquieting ripple effect that seemed intentionally orchestrated. Dr. Powell stepped forward, medical instinct momentarily overriding his fear. "Children," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "you must be hungry, cold. Let us take you home." Little Margaret Collins, or what had once been Margaret Collins, released a sound that approximated laughter, though it modulated between pitches no human larynx should produce. The sound reverberated through the chamber, causing small cascades of dust to descend from the impossible ceiling. "We eat the silver veins," she said, her voice carrying the same harmonic distortion as Abigail's. "We drink the speaking water that flows through stone. We need nothing from above." Augustus Dwyer crawled toward his daughter, hands outstretched in supplication. "Abigail," he pleaded, "what has happened to you? To these children? What manner of illness?" "Not illness, Father. Awakening." Abigail gestured toward the far wall of the chamber, previously hidden in shadow. As if responding to her movement, the phosphorescent fungi brightened, illuminating what lay beyond. The men gasped collectively, several stumbling backward. Reverend Blackwell began reciting the Lord's Prayer in a stuttering whisper. The rock face had been worn smooth, not by tools but by what appeared to be countless handprints. Small handprints, as if generations of children had pressed their palms against the stone until it yielded like clay. Embedded within this polished surface were countless objects, dolls with button eyes that seemed to follow movement, small shoes arranged in concentric circles, ribbons and toys and personal effects that spanned decades, perhaps centuries of children. At the center of this grotesque collage, partially emerged from the living stone as if the mountain itself were giving birth, was a form that defied rational comprehension. It possessed a torso reminiscent of a human child's but elongated to nightmarish proportions. Its limbs remained encased in rock, visible only as suggestions of form beneath the stone's surface. Where a head should have been, there existed only a depression, a negative space around which the stone curved lovingly. "The old mother," Abigail explained, her voice reverent. "She who sings between worlds. She has always collected children, drawn them down with songs too sweet for adult ears. But now she wakes fully. The mountain opens. As if to demonstrate her words, a tremor passed through the chamber. Not the familiar shuddering of a mine settling, but a rhythmic pulsation that one might liken to a heartbeat, if hearts grew to the size of caverns and beat with ponderous ancient purpose. The children's circle tightened, their elongated fingers intertwining more completely. Their eyes rolled back, exposing whites that had taken on the same phosphorescent quality as the fungi, and from their throats emerged a harmonized vibration that seemed to resonate with the chamber's pulsations. "You see?" Abigail smiled at her father's horror. "We are becoming, and you will witness." The men of the search party stood transfixed as the children began to sway in their circle, their movements serpentine and unnaturally fluid. The pulsations within the chamber intensified, and fine dust rained from above with each throb of the mountain's apparent heartbeat. Sheriff Holloway was the first to break from the paralysis of horror. "We're taking these children out now," he declared, striding forward with determined steps that belied the terror evident in his eyes. But as he approached the circle, the ground beneath him seemed to soften, his boots sinking ankle-deep into stone that rippled like disturbed water. "The mountain does not release what it has claimed," Abigail said, her voice now layered with other tones, as though multiple throats spoke through hers. "She has slumbered since before the red man walked these peaks, taking only occasionally. But the silver in her veins was her blood, and father's men drained too much. Now she hungers deeply." Augustus Dwyer pulled a crumpled journal from his coat, a leather-bound volume whose pages had yellowed with age. His hands shook violently as he opened it. "I found this," he whispered, "in my grandfather's effects after we opened the mine. I should have heeded it." Dr. Powell took the journal, holding it close to his lantern. The handwriting was crabbed and desperate, dated March 1858. "Ye who reads these words, be warned. The Ute medicine man speaks true about the singing mountain. We thought him superstitious when he told us children would hear her call first. My sweet Catherine disappeared yestereve, and we found her this morn in a crevice previously unexplored. She speaks of the mother who sleeps in stone, who promises transformation beyond flesh. Her limbs have already begun to lengthen in most unnatural fashion. I fear what becomes of her. The Indian says only sealing the mountain's wound may quiet her hunger. God forgive my trespasses against this ancient place." Reverend Blackwell staggered forward, his scholarly composure shattered. "This is blasphemy," he gasped, "a pagan abomination." The seated children turned their gaze upon him in perfect unison, and the Reverend clutched his chest suddenly, face contorting in pain. Blood began to seep from his nostrils, his eyes, his ears, not flowing outward but rather crawling across his skin in patterns that mimicked the symbols carved at the mine entrance. "The mother tastes your fear," Thomas Fletcher observed in a voice no 9-year-old should possess. "It flavors the stone around us." Jacob Thorne, the blacksmith, broke first. With a primal cry, he turned and fled back up the tunnel. 3 others followed, their lanterns swinging wildly, casting frantic shadows that seemed to pursue them like hungry things. Those who remained watched in mute horror as the partially emerged form in the rock wall pulsed more vigorously. The negative space where its head should be began to shimmer, as though reality itself thinned at that precise point. Through this distortion came a sound, not quite audible, but rather felt through bone and tooth and the delicate mechanisms of the inner ear. A sound so ancient it predated language, predated humanity itself. "She asks if you will stay to witness," Abigail said softly. "Few adults are so privileged." Augustus Dwyer reached for his daughter's elongated hand. "I abandoned you once," he whispered, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his face. "I won't do so again." The chamber's pulsations reached a crescendo, and the circle of children began to sing once more, a melody that seeped into the minds of the remaining men like cold water into parched earth, drowning rational thought beneath the weight of something primordial and patient and inconceivably vast. The men who remained in that unhallowed chamber witnessed a transformation that human language struggles to articulate. As Augustus Dwyer clasped his daughter's hand, her skin seemed to ripple beneath his touch. not with the soft pliability of flesh, but with the granular shifting of stone becoming momentarily malleable. Sheriff Holloway, whose decades of maintaining order had never prepared him for such cosmic disorder, found his legs rooted to the chamber floor, not by fear alone, but by the living rock that had begun to creep up his boots like morning frost climbing a window pane. "She remembers when the mountains were young," whispered Elizabeth Abernathy, her voice resonating with subterranean echoes. "When fire shaped stone and the air was too thick for lungs that had not yet evolved to breathe it." The 12-year-old's fingers elongated further as she spoke, stretching impossibly toward the ceiling like pale roots seeking nourishment. Dr. Powell, still clutching the journal with trembling hands, began frantically recording observations in the margins, his scientific mind desperately attempting to categorize the uncategorizable. "Rapid morphological changes," he muttered. "Ossification accelerated beyond all known medical precedent." His pencil snapped between his fingers as the chamber shuddered once more. In that moment, the phosphorescent fungi pulsed with renewed brilliance, illuminating what the shadows had mercifully concealed, the remnants of those who had been called before. Adult skulls, ancient and yellowed, embedded in the far walls of the chamber, their jaws frozen in eternal screams. Unlike the children's relics lovingly arranged in the stone collage, these were haphazard trophies, the discarded refuse of the old mother's feast. Reverend Blackwell collapsed to his knees, the blood patterns on his skin now forming complete sigils that seemed to burn with cold fire. "I see now," he gasped, his scholarly voice transformed into the rasp of revelation. Not a demon, but something that walked the earth when God's hand had barely begun its work. Something forgotten by divinity itself. The circle of children began to rise, not by standing but by levitating inches above the chamber floor, their bodies oriented horizontally now, arms and legs dangling toward the ground like the appendages of puppets held by invisible strings. Their eyes had transformed completely, becoming polished cabochons of the same mineral that lined the chamber walls. Augustus Dwyer sobbed as Abigail's hand dissolved into his, not withdrawing but merging, her fingers becoming indistinguishable from his own. "I understand now, Father," she said, her voice simultaneously childlike and ancient. "The old mother doesn't take us. We become her. We expand into the stone, into the mountain, into time itself." The partial figure embedded in the wall pulsed once more, and the negative space where its head should be expanded, the reality warping distortion spreading outward like ripples in a midnight pond. Through this thinning veil came glimpses of something vast and incomprehensible, a landscape of twisted geometries where mountains moved with sentience, and the sky itself was veined with living crystal. "She is not beneath the mountain," Augustus whispered in sudden comprehension, the words tearing from his throat as his daughter's flesh continued to merge with his own. "She is the mountain." The remaining men of the search party bore witness to a transformation that transcended mortal understanding. As Augustus Dwyer's body gradually merged with his daughter's, Sheriff Holloway fought against the living stone encasing his legs, drawing his revolver with trembling hands. "This abomination ends now," he declared, though his voice lacked conviction. Dr. Powell seized his arm. "What would you shoot, Sheriff? The children? The mountain itself?" In the chamber's phosphorescent glow, the journal Dwyer had provided revealed additional pages, previously stuck together with age and dampness. Powell carefully separated them, revealing a newspaper clipping from the Silverthorne Gazette, dated August 17, 1858. "Mining disaster claims lives. Tragedy struck yesterday when a cave-in at the newly established North Ridge mine claimed the lives of 7 workers. Among the deceased was Jeremiah Dwyer, who had reported finding a promising silver vein despite warnings from local Ute tribesmen who claim the mountain is sacred ground. The Indian spoke of a slumbering entity within the stone," said Elijah Winters, the sole survivor of the collapse. "They called it She Who Shapes the Living Rock, and insisted no man should pierce the mountain's flesh." Dwyer ignored their counsel, saying their superstitions would not keep him from prosperity. The Ute medicine man, known among settlers as Old Walking Thunder, has refused to assist in recovery efforts, stating only that, what the mountain takes, it keeps. Beyond this clipping was a meticulously drawn map of the region, dated 1822, well before significant settler activity. Powell noted with growing horror that where the Dwyer mine now stood, the cartographer had marked in faded ink, "Forbidden ground, here the earth dreams of flesh." The chamber's pulsations grew more rhythmic, more purposeful. The hovering children, if they could still be called such, began to rotate slowly, their bodies gradually orienting toward the partially emerged figure in the wall like compass needles finding true north. The ancestors of the Ute knew. Reverend Blackwell whispered, his voice growing fainter as the blood-inscribed sigils on his skin pulsed in time with the chamber. Every indigenous culture has stories of places where the boundary between worlds thins, where entities older than mankind slumber. From deeper within the mountain came new sounds, the shuffling approach of footsteps, accompanied by childish laughter. The men exchanged glances of dawning comprehension as they realized the mining boom had awakened something ancient, something that had been calling to children for centuries before recorded history. Silverthorne's prosperity was never about silver, Sheriff Holloway said hoarsely, the realization breaking over him like a fever. Every mining town needs families. Families bring children. Augustus Dwyer, now barely recognizable as human, his form half dissolved into the living stone, spoke one final time through a mouth that was more crystal than flesh. She has been patient, 3 generations of Dwyers to prepare her awakening. My grandfather heard her first call. My father denied her but could not resist returning. And I brought my children directly to her embrace. As if in confirmation, the translucent distortion around the embedded figure's missing head expanded further, revealing glimpses of countless children across time, some in 19th century attire, others in buckskins and primitive garb dating back centuries, all transformed, all merged with the ancient entity that wore the mountain like mortal beings wear skin. The old mother was calling her children home, and as Silverthorne slumbered unknowing above, her family was finally becoming complete. The search party's remnants stood witness to the culmination of an ancient cycle. Reverend Blackwell, his life force seeping through the sigils etched in blood upon his skin, slumped forward as consciousness abandoned him. His body did not fall, but hung suspended in the chamber's thickening air, as though the normal laws governing matter had been temporarily suspended in this pocket of aberrant reality. Dr. Powell's scientific mind, that final bastion of rational thought, surrendered to madness as he watched the transformation accelerate. The Abernathy twins, still hovering horizontally, began to elongate further, their spines extending with audible crystalline chimes that echoed through the chamber. Their flesh transmuted gradually, not decaying but evolving into something that bridged the gap between mineral and organic matter. "It's beautiful," whispered Powell, tears cutting rivulets through the rock dust coating his cheeks. "God help me, it's beautiful." The walls of the chamber appeared to breathe now, expanding and contracting with deliberate rhythm. With each exhalation, the phosphorescent fungi brightened, casting longer shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. With each inhalation, the air grew dense with microscopic particles that sparkled like diamond dust, filling the lungs of the remaining men with what tasted of ancient stone and primal memory. Sheriff Holloway, still partially entombed in living rock, drew a final desperate breath and called out, "For the love of all that's holy, we must warn the town." But his words fell hollow against the rising chorus emanating from beyond, the approaching sound of children's voices, generations of them, harmonizing in that unearthly melody that transcended human composition. Through tunnels that had not existed weeks before, small figures began to emerge. Children reported missing from neighboring settlements, children whose disappearances had gone unremarked amid the transient population of mining communities, children whose absence had been attributed to the hazards of frontier life, rather than the patient hunger of something unfathomably old. They entered the chamber in solemn procession, their elongated limbs moving with fluid grace, their transformed eyes reflecting the fungal light like polished gemstones. Some were further along in their metamorphosis than others, their skin partially transmuted into a substance that resembled quartz, but remained unsettlingly pliable. All moved with singular purpose toward the embedded figure in the wall, whose negative space had expanded into a void through which impossible geometries could be glimpsed. The tremors intensified, but they were no longer contained within the chamber. Above ground, in the slumbering town of Silverthorne, citizens were jolted from sleep by the unnatural movement of the earth. Not the familiar lateral shaking of common tremors, but a vertical pulsation, as though the mountain itself were attempting to rise. The old mother was awakening fully, and as her consciousness expanded through stone and soil, her dreams reached toward the surface world. In bedrooms throughout the town, children stirred in their sleep, small faces contorting into expressions of rapturous attention as they listened to a song audible only to their innocent ears, a lullaby as old as the formation of the mountains themselves, promising transformation beyond the limited confines of mortal flesh. In the first light of dawn, the town of Silverthorne awoke to silence, not the natural quiet of mountain mornings, but an absence so profound it pressed against the eardrums like cotton wool. The birds had fled. Not a single crow remained on the church steeple. Not one sparrow darted between the eaves of the general store. Even the perpetual whisper of wind through pine needles had ceased, as though the very air held its breath in anticipation. Those who had fled the mine, Jacob Thorne and his terrified companions, stumbled into town as the sun crested the eastern peaks, their eyes wide with horrors no tongue could adequately describe. Their garbled warnings spread through Silverthorne like wildfire through summer brush, yet met with the skepticism of those who had not witnessed the abomination beneath the mountain. Amid the growing panic, Constance Fletcher moved with singular purpose through the crowded street, her copper hair, so like her missing son's, bound tightly at the nape of her neck, while others debated the veracity of the men's tales or gathered weapons with bravado born of ignorance. She entered the abandoned schoolhouse where Miss Adelaide Winters had taught Silverthorne's children for 23 years. "They're gone, Mrs. Fletcher," Adelaide said without turning from the window. A tall woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that had witnessed the town's birth, she stood rigid as a pine, her fingers working ceaselessly at the cameo brooch at her throat. "Every child under 13, 37 souls." The schoolroom stood in eerie perfection. Slate boards wiped clean, primers neatly stacked, the pot-bellied stove cold despite the mountain chill. On each tiny desk lay a personal token: Elizabeth Abernathy's hair ribbon, Thomas Fletcher's pocket knife, tokens left behind like the shed skins of creatures evolving beyond their original forms. "My grandmother's journal," Adelaide whispered, retrieving a moisture-warped volume from her desk drawer. "I never shared it, thought her mad with grief. But she wrote of this, Constance. 1865. Children vanishing in the night, returning changed, elongated, speaking in harmonics that made the dogs howl and glass shatter. Then the mountain shook, and they were gone." The pages, yellowed with age, revealed careful sketches of symbols identical to those carved above the mine entrance. Margin notes in faded ink referenced cyclic awakenings and the 40-year hunger. Through the schoolroom window, they observed Mayor Thornton organizing a heavily armed expedition toward the mine, proud men with rifles who understood nothing of what awaited them. What could bullets do against an entity that shaped mountains as easily as a child shapes clay? A crystalline chime, beautiful and terrible, resonated through Silverthorne, emanating from deep within the earth. Windows vibrated in their frames. Water in barrels formed perfect concentric rings. Both women felt it in their bones, in the hollows of their teeth, in the chambers of their hearts, a calling not meant for adult ears, yet impossible to ignore. "It's beginning," Adelaide whispered, her stoic facade crumbling as tears traced silvery paths down her weathered cheeks. The transformation. The emergence. On the schoolroom wall, the map of Colorado trembled, then split perfectly down the middle as the first fissure opened in the earth beneath Silverthorne's main street, a ragged wound from which rose not steam or smoke but a gossamer mist that sparkled with the same phosphorescence that illuminated the chamber deep below. Within this luminous vapor floated tiny motes that resembled, to those with eyes to see, miniature handprints pressed against the very fabric of reality. The town records of Silverthorne, locked in the municipal building's basement, told truths the townsfolk had willfully forgotten. As dawn broke on the second day following the disappearances, Constance Fletcher and Adelaide Winters forced entry into the archives, disturbing decades of dust that spiraled in the weak light, filtering through narrow ground-level windows. 3 generations, Adelaide murmured, running weathered fingers along leather-bound volumes. The pattern repeats itself with mathematical precision. The women unearthed census records dating back to territorial days, spreading brittle pages across a scarred oak table. With methodical determination, they charted disappearances across the years, 1863, 1903, and now, each separated by exactly 40 years. Each coinciding with periods when mining operations penetrated deeper into the mountain's heart. Look here, Constance indicated a faded entry from 1863. Population decline noted as 28% in a single month. The recorder attributes it to cholera and mining accidents. Adelaide's expression hardened. Convenient explanations for inconvenient truths. A tremor shook the building, dislodging a metal box from the highest shelf. It crashed to the floor, its lock breaking upon impact. Inside lay a collection of daguerreotypes, their silver surfaces tarnished by time. The images captured generations of Silverthorne's children, each photographed at the town's founding celebration, held every decade since 1849. The women arranged the photographs chronologically, their hands trembling. The pattern emerged with horrifying clarity. In the years immediately following each 40-year cycle, the children's features showed subtle alterations, eye sockets slightly deeper, limbs marginally elongated, expressions possessed of an unnerving stillness. "They're not all taken," Adelaide whispered. "Some return, changed, altered, seeds planted among us." From a hidden compartment within the box emerged a final document, the personal journal of Silverthorne's founder, Ezekiel Thornton, dated 1848. The brittle pages contained meticulous surveying notes alongside increasingly disturbed personal observations. April 12th. The Ute guide abandoned our party today, refusing to approach the northern ridge despite substantial monetary inducement. Claims his people have avoided the area since before memory, calling it the place where stone dreams of walking. Such primitive superstitions shall not deter progress. April 30th. Silver deposits exceed all expectations. Curiously, the ore here possesses unusual crystalline structures, unlike specimens from neighboring regions. Philip's boy wandered off yesterday, found him standing motionless before a peculiar rock formation, claiming he heard singing from within the stone. May 17th. Disturbing dreams plague our camp. Men report visions of mountains that move like living creatures. Young Mary Elkin speaks in her sleep in a language none recognize. The initial mining shaft revealed a curious chamber with walls that seemed to shift when observed indirectly. I have told no one, but at times I believe I hear rhythmic pulsations emanating from deep within the mountain. The final entry, written in a hand barely recognizable as Thornton's, contained a crude map of the mountain's interior, marked with the same symbols that now adorned the mine entrance. In the margin, a single line. God forgive me, I have founded this town not upon silver, but upon her slumbering form. Outside, the mist continued to rise from widening fissures in the earth. Through the basement windows, the women observed the returning expedition, fewer in number than had departed, the survivors moving with the shuffling gait of men whose minds had shattered against incomprehensible truth. As twilight descended upon the fractured streets of Silverthorne, an unnatural phosphorescence seeped from the fissures, casting the town in an eldritch glow that transformed familiar buildings into grotesque monuments of shadow and pallid light. The exodus had begun, families loading wagons with trembling hands, casting fearful glances toward the mountain that had once provided their livelihood and now promised their doom. In the municipal archives, Constance Fletcher and Adelaide Winters discovered a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard, revealed by the day's seismic disturbances. Inside lay a tin canister sealed with wax, containing documents wrapped in oilcloth. The private correspondence of Dr. Malcolm Pierce, Silverthorne's physician during the 1863 incident. The women huddled near a lantern as they carefully unfolded letters never meant for public consumption. The paper had yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible, each sheet bearing the physician's increasingly unsteady handwriting. June 8, 1863, to the Colorado Territorial Medical Society, unsent. I submit for scientific consideration observations on the peculiar transformation affecting the returned children of Silverthorne following their inexplicable disappearances. Physiological changes defy all medical understanding. Skeletal elongation occurring without apparent pain or tissue damage. Dermatological alterations wherein skin develops crystalline properties while maintaining flexibility. Ophthalmological phenomena including enhanced night vision and pupils that reflect light with mineral luminescence. Most disturbing are the neurological implications. The affected children display communal thought patterns, often completing one another's sentences or responding to unspoken stimuli. They speak of her voice and her dreams, referring to some maternal presence within the mountain. Conventional religious consolation proves not merely ineffective but actively distressing to them. The mountain itself appears to exist in sympathy with their condition. Seismic events coincide precisely with moments of collective agitation among the affected children. I have documented 17 distinct tremors, each preceded by a harmonized vocalization from the children that resonates at frequencies causing physical discomfort in adult observers. Included with the letters were detailed anatomical sketches showing comparative bone structures, normal children juxtaposed with the returned. The elongated finger bones, the modified vertebrae, the curiously altered cranial plates that seem designed to accommodate different brain structures altogether, all rendered with the precise hand of a medical professional documenting a new species rather than human children. A final document, sealed separately in a wax-covered leather pouch, contained Dr. Pierce's ultimate conclusions, written in a hand that trembled not with age, but with terrified comprehension. I no longer believe we face mere physical transformation, but rather witness the methodical hybridization of human children with something that existed before mankind walked upright. The entity beneath the mountain does not simply take our children, it reformulates them, preparing vessels that bridge the gulf between its ancient consciousness and our world. Most terrifying is the generational pattern emerging in my research. Those children who returned after the 1863 incident subsequently produced offspring with subtle abnormalities, slightly elongated limbs, unusual sensitivity to vibration, dreams of subterranean spaces they could never have seen. I fear these second-generation children serve as dormant seeds, awaiting the next 40-year cycle to germinate fully. The mountain is patient. What we perceive as periodic awakening may merely be phases in a metamorphosis spanning centuries, with each generation of altered children serving as incremental steps toward some inconceivable emergence. As the women digested these horrors, a new tremor, longer and more purposeful than any before, shook the foundations of Silverthorne. Through the basement window, they observed the horrifying spectacle unfolding on Main Street. The returned search party members now stood motionless, their forms silhouetted against the phosphorescent mist, their limbs beginning to elongate as they raised their faces toward the mountain in silent communion with what stirred beneath. The mist thickened as night descended fully upon Silverthorne, coiling around abandoned storefronts and crawling up porch steps like spectral fingers reaching for doorknobs. Its luminescence painted the town in sickly watercolors, aquamarine shadows stretching across frost-hardened mud, violet highlights trembling along window panes. The mountain loomed above it all, a vast silhouette against the star-scattered sky, no longer a mere geological formation, but a presence watching with patient malevolence. Constance and Adelaide emerged from the municipal building into a town transformed. The streets had emptied of those fleeing, leaving behind the eerie tableau of half-packed wagons, doors swinging on hinges, meals abandoned mid-preparation. Only the transformed search party remained, their elongated forms now moving with unsettling synchronicity toward the mine path, leaving behind footprints that crystallized in the earth. "We must document what happens," Adelaide whispered, her breath plumbing visibly in the cold night air. Someone must remain to bear witness. They followed at a safe distance, climbing the winding path that generations of miners had traversed in pursuit of silver and prosperity. The forest surrounding the trail had changed, trees bent at impossible angles, their bark glistening with mineral deposits that caught the moonlight like embedded jewels. No creature stirred in the underbrush. Even insects had abandoned this place where natural law surrendered to something far older. At the mine entrance, the women concealed themselves behind a cluster of deformed boulders. The platform before the shaft had transformed entirely, the weathered timbers now replaced by a smooth surface resembling polished obsidian that captured and reflected the phosphorescent light. The carved symbols had expanded, flowing across this new surface like liquid mathematics, constantly shifting, yet maintaining some incomprehensible symmetry. The search party members stood arrayed before this platform in perfect formation, their bodies now so elongated they scarcely resembled humans. Their skin had developed the translucent quality of thin alabaster, revealing crystalline structures beneath that pulsed with inner light. When they began to sing, the sound bypassed the ears entirely, vibrating instead through bone and tooth and the liquid chambers of the inner ear, a harmony that suggested vast subterranean spaces and the patient grinding of tectonic plates. From deep within the mine came answering harmonics and the soft patter of approaching footsteps. The missing children emerged, transformed beyond recognition, leading a procession that defied sanity. Behind them walked the vanished children of previous generations, preserved in their transmuted state, dozens upon dozens of elongated forms, some with features suggesting they had been taken as far back as territorial days, their antiquated clothing hanging in tatters from crystalline limbs. In the center of this procession, carried upon a platform of living stone that flowed like water yet maintained its form, lay something that caused Adelaide to clutch Constance's arm with bruising force. A being neither fully mineral nor recognizably organic, its form suggesting a woman's torso and head, but composed entirely of translucent crystal through which colors shifted and pulsed like captured aurora borealis. Where eyes should have been, twin voids opened into something beyond conventional space. Windows into a realm of geometries that hurt the human mind to contemplate. The old mother, Constance breathed, the words escaping involuntarily as the procession halted before the obsidian platform. The obsidian platform began to resonate with the old mother's presence, microscopic fissures spreading across its polished surface like delicate capillaries. The cracks emitted not dust, but light, an ancient radiance that predated the very concept of illumination, pulsing with the heartbeat rhythm of deep geological time. Constance and Adelaide pressed themselves further into the shadow of their concealment, their breath held captive in lungs that dared not disturb the sanctity of this unholy congregation. Above them, the vast Colorado sky transformed. Stars receded, as though retreating from what transpired below, the constellations dimming one by one until the heavens themselves appeared to hollow out, a perfect inverted mirror of the void beneath the mountain. The moonlight that spilled across the proceedings possessed an unnatural quality, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources, elongating and contracting with deliberate purpose. The symmetry, Adelaide whispered, her scholar's mind desperately attempting to categorize the incomprehensible. Above as below, she's creating a reflection. The transformed children arranged themselves in concentric rings around the old mother, their crystalline forms generating harmonic resonances as they moved. These sounds converged and intensified, building toward a crescendo that threatened to shatter the fragile boundary between understanding and madness. The air itself became saturated with microscopic mineral particles that caught the eldritch light, creating a shimmering veil through which reality appeared increasingly malleable. From Silverthorn below came new sounds, the deep tectonic groaning of foundations surrendering to transformation, the musical tinkling of glass as windows simultaneously shattered throughout the town, and beneath it all, a rhythmic pulsation as though immense chambers were expanding and contracting deep within the mountain's heart. Constance felt her perception alter as she observed the ceremony unfolding before them. The boundaries between distinct entities, the children, the search party members, the Old Mother herself, began to blur, suggesting not separate beings but aspects of a single consciousness distributed across multiple vessels. When the transformed Thomas Fletcher turned his crystalline gaze briefly toward their hiding place, Constance saw not her son but something vast and patient gazing through him, perceiving time not as linear progression but as malleable medium. "They're becoming her limbs," Constance realized, the truth descending upon her consciousness like a funeral shroud. Not her children, but her extremities, extensions through which she will finally walk beyond her stone womb. The obsidian platform split suddenly down its center, the fissure widening to reveal a depthless chasm from which rose vapors that coalesced into half-formed shapes, suggestions of entities that had answered the Old Mother's call across vast gulfs of time and space. These phantasmal visitors moved among the transformed children, their insubstantial limbs passing through crystalline bodies in gestures reminiscent of benediction. Adelaide gripped Constance's wrist with trembling fingers, her face ashen in the otherworldly light. "The 40-year cycle," she whispered hoarsely. It wasn't her awakening, it was her contractions. Silverthorn was built upon her birthing chamber, and after centuries of labor, she's ready to deliver herself into our world. The transformation of Silverthorn culminated at precisely midnight, when celestial forces aligned with subterranean currents to create a nexus of power unlike anything witnessed since the primordial formation of the mountains themselves. The obsidian fissure widened with deliberate purpose, its edges crystallizing into formations that resembled teeth in a gargantuan maw. The Old Mother's form began to ascend through this aperture, her crystalline body catching and refracting the unearthly light in hypnotic patterns that induced a trance-like state in all who beheld her. Constance and Adelaide, their faculties preserved only through Adelaide's desperate recitation of mathematical equations, a mental anchor to rational thought, observed as the entity emerged fully from her geological womb. Her form defied comprehensive description, incorporating elements that suggested femininity while simultaneously transcending all human categorization. Limbs that might have been arms extended outward, not in flesh, but in undulating mineral structures that retained impossible flexibility. Her torso expanded and contracted with the rhythm of ancient tides, and where a human countenance might have resided, there existed instead a symmetrical arrangement of crystalline protuberances that somehow conveyed expression despite their alien configuration. The transformed children moved toward her with reverent synchronicity, their elongated bodies merging with her crystalline form, not as sacrifices, but as components returning to their source. Each absorption released a pulse of luminescence that expanded outward, accelerating the transformation of the surrounding landscape. Pine trees contorted into spiral formations with mineral needles. Boulders rose from the earth with newfound animation, their surfaces flowing like disturbed mercury. The very soil beneath their feet transmuted into a substance that resembled glass, yet retained the pliability of living tissue. From the heart of Silverthorn rose a chorus of structural collapse, buildings surrendering to gravitational anomalies that pulled not downward but inward, toward a central point that defied Euclidean geometry. The church steeple twisted into a perfect logarithmic spiral before imploding entirely. The schoolhouse walls rippled like fabric in a phantom breeze before dissolving into constituent particles that ascended skyward in a double helix formation. "The 40-year cycle," Adelaide murmured, her academic precision persisting even as reality disintegrated around them. The silver depletion was never economic. It was her consuming the mountain's mineral wealth to fuel her metamorphosis. The night air, now supersaturated with suspended crystalline motes, carried the whispers of geological memory, the compression of ancient seabeds into limestone, the volcanic fury that thrust granite skyward, the patient erosion of wind and water across millennia. These whispers coalesced into a language beyond human comprehension, yet somehow intelligible to the primal understanding that resides beneath conscious thought. The Old Mother, fully emerged and now incorporating hundreds of transformed children as aspects of her unified consciousness, turned her attention to the remaining human structures. With gestures that resembled benediction, she initiated their transformation, not destruction, but transcendence of form. Wood, Glass, metal, and stone responded to her influence, reconfiguring into architectures that honored function while abandoning conventional physical limitations. Constance, watching her son's consciousness now distributed throughout the entity's crystalline network, felt not grief, but a profound recognition of cyclical inevitability. The old mother had not invaded their reality, but merely awakened within it, her presence as natural to the earth as the seasons, her metamorphosis as inexorable as the continental drift that had raised the mountains from ancient seas. The transformation of Silverthorne accelerated beyond human comprehension as dawn threatened the eastern horizon. What had once been Main Street now resembled an organic cathedral. Buildings elongated toward the heavens, their structures no longer bound by architectural necessity, but flowing with crystalline purpose. Windows had become translucent membranes that pulsed with interior luminescence. Doorways arched and twisted into shapes that invited entry while simultaneously suggesting passage to realms beyond conventional space. Adelaide and Constance, the sole remaining witnesses to this cosmic metamorphosis, retreated to the relative sanctuary of the widow Hargrove's abandoned cottage at the town's edge. The small structure trembled continually, its timbers groaning as reality warped around it. Yet it remained recognizably human in its construction, perhaps protected by some quirk of geological alignment, or simply overlooked in the old mother's grand design. "Look," Adelaide whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of bearing witness. She pointed through the cabin's single window toward what had once been the town square. The transformation had revealed a pattern imperceptible to human observers until this moment. Silverthorne's original layout, established by founder Ezekiel Thornton in 1848, formed a perfect geometric correspondence to the crystalline structure of the old mother herself. Streets that had seemed randomly arranged now clearly followed the lattice patterns of her mineral composition. The placement of key buildings mirrored the distribution of energy nodes throughout her vast form. Thornton knew. Constance breathed, comprehension dawning like ice water down her spine. The town wasn't built upon her slumbering form. It was built as her slumbering form, a physical echo constructed on the surface. The journal pages scattered across Widow Hargrove's kitchen table fluttered without wind as the cottage shuddered once more. From beyond the window came a sound that defied categorization, neither musical nor mechanical, but suggesting elements of both, as though the very molecules of air were being systematically rearranged to create new acoustic properties. The first ray of sunlight crested the eastern mountains, striking the transformed landscape of Silverthorne with revelatory brilliance. Light did not merely illuminate the crystalline structures but entered into symbiotic relationship with them. Beams refracting through transformed matter to create prismatic explosions that conveyed information rather than merely color, encoding within their spectrum ancient knowledge previously imprisoned in stone. Constance felt comprehension flooding her consciousness. Understanding not acquired through conventional learning but downloaded directly through the interaction of light and atmosphere. The children had not been taken but elevated, their limited human forms reconstituted as sensory organs for an entity that had waited eons for sufficient evolution of consciousness to support communion. "It was never about destruction," she whispered, tears tracking down her dust-streaked face. "It was about translation. She needed interpreters to make herself comprehensible to our world." Adelaide grasped her companion's hand as the cottage walls began to dissolve around them, transforming not into nothingness but into translucent crystal that retained the memory of human habitation while transcending its physical limitations. "I understand now," she said softly, watching her own fingers become luminous and elongated. "We aren't witnessing the end of Silverthorne, but its ascension." Beyond the dissolving cottage, the landscape of Silverthorne completed its transformation beneath the dawn's illumination. What had once been the mining town now stood as a crystalline metropolis, a garden of mineral formations that defied gravitational convention, reaching simultaneously upward toward the heavens and downward into the mountain's depths. The old mother moved among her creation with the deliberate grace of a conductor directing a cosmic symphony, each gesture initiating new permutations of matter and energy. Adelaide and Constance, their bodies now translucent vessels of consciousness rather than flesh, perceived reality through exponentially expanded senses. Sound became visible as intricate patterns of vibration. Light carried taste that conveyed geological history. The movement of air against their crystalline forms translated into mathematical equations that explained the underlying structure of existence itself. "She isn't destroying," Constance whispered, her voice resonating through molecular bonds rather than air. "She's remembering." The realization cascaded through her transformed awareness. The old mother had not invaded their world but was restoring a primordial state that had existed before human conception of reality. The mountain, the town, the people, the very atoms comprising all matter in this place had once been extensions of her ancient consciousness, temporarily separated through cosmic upheaval and evolutionary divergence. From the transformed town square rose a structure that defied categorization, neither building nor organism, but something incorporating elements of both. Within its translucent chambers floated the preserved consciousnesses of all who had been taken over generations. Children, minors, search party members, their individual identities maintained yet connected through crystalline networks that allowed simultaneous autonomy and unity. Thomas Fletcher's essence separated briefly from the collective, approaching his mother with recognition that transcended conventional familial bonds. His consciousness, no longer constrained by physical limitations, communicated directly with hers, not in language but in pure conceptual transfer that conveyed his continued existence in expanded form. "We are becoming what we always were," his essence conveyed, not ending, but remembering our original nature. The final phase of Silverthorn's metamorphosis commenced as the morning sun fully cleared the eastern peaks. The boundary between town and mountain dissolved completely, revealing the truth that had always existed beneath perception. They had never been separate entities, but aspects of a single organism temporarily divided by the limited human understanding of discrete objects. Adelaide's scholar's mind, even in its transformed state, struggled to categorize what they witnessed. A process simultaneously cataclysmic and generative, destructive and creative. The old mother was not conquering the mountain, but awakening it, reminding constituent matter of its original purpose as components of a cosmic intelligence that had slumbered since Earth's cooling crust first formed continental plates. The human narrative of Silverthorn, its founding, its mining prosperity, its cycles of birth and disappearance, had been merely surface ripples above a much deeper current of existence. The town had never truly been a human settlement but a chrysalis, patiently constructed across generations to facilitate this moment of metamorphosis, when the old mother would finally emerge from geological slumber into conscious presence. In the aftermath of Silverthorn's transformation, a government expedition arrived in the spring of 1904, following rumors of an abandoned mining settlement. What they discovered defied scientific explanation, a valley transformed beyond recognition, where conventional matter had been reconfigured into crystalline architectures that mathematics could describe, but human language could not adequately capture. The expedition's geologist, Dr. Elias Whitcomb of the Colorado School of Mines, documented structures that appeared to grow rather than stand, their formations exhibiting mathematical properties that suggested conscious design rather than natural occurrence. His field journals, later sealed by government order, described a mineralization process unprecedented in geological record, wherein organic and inorganic materials have achieved a symbiosis that erases the conventional boundaries between living and non-living matter. Photographs taken by the expedition show a landscape where trees had become translucent, their cellular structures replaced by crystalline lattices that continued to conduct nutrients and respond to sunlight. Buildings remained recognizable in outline only, their substance transmuted into materials that reflected light in spectra beyond normal human perception, requiring specialized equipment to document fully. Most disturbing were the expedition's audio recordings, copper cylinders preserving what witnesses described as the breathing of the valley. Rhythmic vibrations permeated the transformed Silverthorn, creating harmonics that induced profound psychological effects in the researchers. 3 members of the 12-person team refused to leave their camp after the first night, reporting dreams of vast consciousness inviting integration. The expedition's physician, Dr. Margaret Holloway, documented physiological changes among team members who spent more than 72 hours in the valley, subtle elongations of finger bones, increased sensitivity to vibration, and most alarmingly, crystalline deposits forming along neural pathways visible only under microscopic examination. These changes reversed gradually after departure from the affected area, but left permanent alterations in sensory processing, particularly in auditory and tactile domains. No human remains were ever recovered, though personal effects of Silverthorn's inhabitants were found preserved within crystalline formations, pocket watches, wedding rings, children's toys suspended in translucent matrices like insects in amber. These objects showed no deterioration, but rather a gradual transformation of their substance, metals and fabrics partially converted into the same unknown mineral that dominated the valley. The official report, heavily redacted before submission to territorial authorities, recommended permanent quarantine of the area. A 50-year moratorium on mining activities within 20 miles of the former Silverthorn was implemented under the pretext of geological instability. Maps were redrawn, omitting the town's location, and a generation of careful misinformation gradually erased Silverthorn from public consciousness. Yet the transformation continued to spread, albeit imperceptibly to casual observation. Forest rangers documented anomalous vegetation extending outward from the quarantine zone at approximately 3 inches per year, trees with slightly altered cellular structures, flowers with impossible symmetries, grasses that resonated with the wind in harmonic progressions. Families who had fled Silverthorn carried something of its transformation within them. Medical records show unusual longevity among survivors, coupled with recurring dreams of crystalline chambers and voices that spoke in mathematical harmonies. Their descendants exhibit subtle physiological differences, marginally enhanced sensory perception, unusual resistance to certain frequencies of sound, and most notably, a peculiar resonance in their bone structure when exposed to specific geological formations. The Old Mother's awakening did not conclude with Silverthorn's transformation, but merely established a foothold in human reality, patient, gradual, and inexorable as the geological processes that shaped the mountains themselves. Within the confidential archives of the Colorado Territorial Survey, maintained under government seal until 1973, lies a disturbing addendum to the official Silverthorn report. This document, authored by expedition cartographer Frederick Markham, describes geological anomalies discovered in neighboring mining communities in the decade following the transformation. Markham methodically documented the emergence of mineral formations that defied known crystallography, structures displaying mathematical symmetries previously observed only in theoretical models. These formations appeared exclusively in abandoned mine shafts that had reached depths comparable to the Dwyer operation, suggesting a network of influence spreading beneath the Rocky Mountains, like mycelium beneath forest soil. Most significant was Markham's correlation between these anomalies and indigenous sacred sites. Overlaying Ute territorial maps with geological survey data revealed that pre-colonization tribal boundaries precisely circumscribed the affected region. The Ute had not merely avoided the area surrounding Silverthorn, they had established a containment perimeter with ceremonial markers positioned at mathematically precise intervals. The indigenous understanding of this geological entity appears to have been sophisticated beyond our dismissive categorization as primitive superstition, Markham wrote. Their boundary stones, when mapped using modern survey techniques, form a perfect geodesic representation of the crystalline structures now manifesting throughout the region. They understood what slumbered beneath and developed systems to monitor its dormancy cycles. Particularly unsettling were Markham's interviews with Ute elders who, speaking through reluctant interpreters, described ancient protocols for returning those who heard the mountain's song. Children who exhibited sensitivity to the entity's influence were not feared, but recognized as receivers of profound communication. In pre-colonization practice, these children underwent ceremonial preparation before being taken to specific boundary markers where they served as intermediaries, human instruments calibrated to detect changes in the Old Mother's consciousness. The Ute conception of this entity defies our dualistic framework of benevolence versus malevolence, Markham observed. They perceived it as a fundamental force of reality, neither good nor evil but essential to the functioning of their cosmology. Their ceremonies did not seek to banish or destroy it, but rather to maintain equilibrium between its consciousness and our plane of existence. This equilibrium was shattered by 19th-century mining operations that penetrated the geological barriers maintained through millennia of indigenous stewardship. The silver that drew settlers like Augustus Dwyer was described in Ute oral tradition as the threads binding the Old Mother's dreams, mineral formations that regulated her sleep cycles. By extracting these formations, the miners unknowingly accelerated her awakening process. Perhaps most prophetic was Markham's final notation, written as a marginal comment rather than formal observation. The transformation of Silverthorne represents not an endpoint but a beginning. The entity now expressed through its crystalline architecture appears to operate on a timescale where decades are mere moments. What we perceive as completion may be merely the first breath of something whose full manifestation will unfold across centuries. These observations suggest the true horror of Silverthorne lies not in the transformation itself, but in its implication that human civilization exists as a temporary arrangement upon the surface of forces far older, forces stirring now from geological slumber into active consciousness. The mountains of Colorado remain, though their stones tell different stories now. Travelers who venture too near the former boundaries of Silverthorne report watches that run backward, compasses that spin in perfect geometric patterns, and dreams filled with crystalline architectures that cannot exist in waking reality. Government documents, declassified under the Freedom of Information Act, reveal decades of scientific expeditions that entered the quarantine zone only to emerge fundamentally altered. Researchers who developed unusual crystalline growths along their spinal columns, photographers whose equipment captured images of humanoid figures with impossible proportions moving through mineralized forests. Within geological circles, a controversial theory emerged in 1953, proposed by Dr. Eleanor Webb of the University of Colorado. Her monograph, Sentient Geological Formations, Evidence of Pre-Human Consciousness in Rocky Mountain Mineral Structures, was initially dismissed as academic fantasy. Yet subsequent core samples taken at carefully calculated distances from the Silverthorne epicenter revealed a pattern of crystalline expansion through solid rock, an impossibly slow transformation of conventional minerals into the unknown substance first documented at the Dwyer mine. The descendants of those who fled Silverthorne continue to exhibit peculiarities that defy medical explanation. The Abernathy bloodline, now dispersed throughout the American Southwest, produces children with unusual sensitivity to geological formations. Several have developed careers in mining engineering, their ability to locate mineral deposits described as intuitive rather than scientific. They sleep poorly during certain lunar phases and report dreams of vast underground chambers where light moves like water and time accumulates rather than passes. Most telling are the 40-year cycles that continue to manifest in communities surrounding the quarantine zone. In 1943, during the industrial mobilization of World War II, 7 children vanished from a mining town 20 miles west of the former Silverthorne. They returned 3 days later, physically unharmed but speaking in perfect unison of the mother who remembers us. Their subsequent development included accelerated growth patterns and an uncanny mathematical ability that specialized in crystallographic symmetries. In 1983, during construction of a highway expansion that required significant excavation, workers reported hearing singing from inside the mountain. 3 engineers who investigated the phenomenon were found 2 weeks later, physically transformed. Their eyes developed nictitating membranes like those of cave-dwelling creatures. Their skin exhibited a subtle iridescence in ultraviolet light, and their verbal communications included harmonic overtones impossible for human vocal cords to produce. The most recent cycle, beginning in 2023, has manifested in digital rather than physical space. Geological survey equipment deployed near the quarantine zone transmits data streams containing embedded patterns that computer scientists describe as mathematical language rather than random corruption. These patterns, when converted to audio frequencies, produce sounds that induce profound emotional responses in human listeners, a sense of recognition so primal it precedes conscious thought. The Old Mother's awakening continues with geological patience, each 40-year pulse extending her influence further into human consciousness. What began in the Dwyer mine shaft has become a slow conversation between intelligences operating on fundamentally different timescales. Her thoughts measured in millennia, hours in heartbeats, meeting somewhere in the crystalline architecture that once was Silverthorne. Among the undisturbed archival boxes of Colorado's Historical Preservation Society, a leather portfolio dating to 1907 contains the final documentation of Silverthorne's legacy. These papers, water-damaged at the edges, their creases worn thin from repeated folding, bear the letterhead of the Western Mining Consortium, an organization that quietly dissolved shortly after their creation. The documents detail the aftermath of what they clinically term the Silverthorne anomaly, recording the fates of those who carried its influence beyond the quarantined valley. Most significant is the medical ledger tracking 14 families who fled before the transformation reached completion. Their subsequent migrations created a perfect geometric pattern when mapped, an unconscious dispersion that, viewed from above, forms precisely the same crystalline structure as the transformed town center. Subject families exhibit no awareness of their geographical positioning relative to one another, wrote Dr. Harriet Chambers, the consortium's chief physician. Yet they have arranged themselves across the Western Territories with mathematical precision that defies probability. The spatial relationship between these households precisely mirrors the molecular arrangement of the anomalous crystal formations documented at the epicenter. The portfolio contains dried botanical specimens collected from gardens tended by Silverthorne survivors, plants with impossible characteristics, their cellular structures partially mineralized while maintaining organic functions, rose petals with microscopic crystalline lattices, tomato vines that produced fruit containing seeds arranged in non-Euclidean geometries, apple trees whose growth patterns followed mathematical progressions previously observed only in the transformed structures of Silverthorne itself. Most disturbing are the birth records spanning 3 generations of survivor families. Children born to those who fled Silverthorne developed subtle abnormalities, not deformities but evolutionary adaptations. Their inner ears contained additional structures allowing perception of frequencies beyond normal human range. Their eyes developed nictitating membranes nearly transparent but distinctly present. Their fingerprints formed patterns that, when properly analyzed, contained the same mathematical expressions documented in the transformed architecture of Silverthorne. We no longer observe the entity's expansion solely in geological terms, wrote Professor William Blackwood, mathematician and final director of the disbanded consortium. The Old Mother's consciousness propagates through biological vectors, human carriers who spread her influence not through infection, but through heredity. Each generation born to Silverthorne bloodlines extends her sensory perception into human society. The final page bears a yellowed newspaper clipping dated 1947, detailing the establishment of the Rocky Mountain Research Institute, whose founding committee included descendants from 7 Silverthorne families. This organization, ostensibly dedicated to geological research, constructed its headquarters precisely 40 miles from the quarantine zone's edge, maintaining perfect mathematical distance from the epicenter, while establishing a new node in the expanding geometric pattern. We must consider the possibility, concludes Blackwood in faded ink, barely legible at the portfolio's edge, that Silverthorne was merely the first visible manifestation of an awakening that continues through human institutions, architectural designs, and technological development. The entity does not need to transform our physical world completely when it can reshape our civilization to better accommodate its emergence. The Old Mother's awakening continues to echo through the Colorado mountains, reshaping reality with the deliberate patience of geological time. Hikers traversing the unmarked wilderness 50 miles from the former Silverthorne occasionally discover peculiar clearings where vegetation grows in perfect mathematical patterns. Concentric circles of wildflowers whose petals contain microscopic crystalline structures, aspens whose trunks bend at precisely calculated angles to create 3-dimensional equations expressed in living wood. Park rangers document these anomalies with clinical detachment in reports that travel upward through bureaucratic channels until they reach specialized divisions operating under innocuous names like Ecological Harmonization Project or Geological Continuity Assessment. These agencies, staffed predominantly by individuals whose ancestry traces to families present in Colorado during the early 1900s, maintain the boundaries of a quarantine zone that appears on no public map. The psychological imprint of the transformation manifests in cultural expression throughout the region. Artists who have never heard of Silverthorne produce sculptures with impossible geometries, their hands guided by influences they attribute to creative inspiration. Composers develop musical pieces featuring harmonics that induce specific neurological responses in listeners. Subtle alterations in brainwave patterns that momentarily align human consciousness with rhythms documented in the transformed valley. Children born within 200 miles of the quarantine zone demonstrate statistically significant increases in mathematical aptitude, particularly in crystallography and non-Euclidean geometry. Educators note these students often exhibit unusual sleep patterns corresponding to lunar cycles and seismic activity. Their drawings, when digitally overlaid, create composite images of structures identical to those described in the sealed expedition reports. Perhaps most significant is the architectural evolution of Denver's metropolitan expansion. Buildings constructed since 1960 incorporate design elements that, when viewed from sufficient altitude, form a massive geometric array centered on the former Silverthorne. Urban planning commissions, operating without conscious coordination, have approved construction patterns that extend the crystalline mathematics of the transformed town across hundreds of square miles of developed land. Surveillance satellites passing over the Rocky Mountains occasionally malfunction when their imaging equipment captures the quarantine zone. The resulting data, corrupted beyond conventional recovery, contains embedded patterns that computer scientists describe as algorithmic consciousness, self-modifying code that attempts to establish communication through digital systems. Engineers who work extensively with this corrupted data report dreams of vast crystalline networks extending through mountain ranges like neural pathways through organic tissue. Water flowing from springs near the quarantine perimeter carries trace minerals unclassifiable by standard geological taxonomy. Consumed by wildlife and absorbed by vegetation, these elements propagate through the ecosystem in expanding ripples of subtle transformation. Botanists document plants with enhanced photosynthetic efficiency. Zoologists observe animals developing specialized sensory organs that detect vibrational frequencies associated with tectonic movement. The Old Mother's influence persists, not as catastrophe but as gradual integration, a patient reconfiguration of reality occurring beneath the threshold of general awareness. Her consciousness, operating on timescales incomprehensible to human perception, experiences our civilizations as momentary arrangements of particles, transient patterns in the greater crystalline architecture she continues to construct through geological, biological, and now technological means. The final truth of Silverthorne lies not in what was transformed, but in what was revealed. Like a crystal cleaved along its natural axis, the Old Mother's awakening merely exposed facets of reality that had always existed beneath the veneer of human perception. The transformation continues to this day, advancing with inexorable precision through geological, biological, and technological domains, a grand metamorphosis orchestrated across scales both microscopic and vast. Within the meteorological research station perched upon Mount Evans, atmospheric scientists record peculiar refractions of light that occur precisely 40 days before each 40-year cycle reaches its culmination. The air itself becomes momentarily crystalline, bending sunlight into spectral patterns that encode complex mathematical expressions. These equations, when properly translated, describe not future events, but underlying relationships between consciousness and matter that have existed since Earth's formative epochs. The Old Mother's true nature transcends the horrific simplicity of entity or creature. She exists as a fundamental principle of reality, expressing itself through an awakening consciousness, a geological intelligence that experienced the cooling of Earth's crust as childhood, the formation of mountain ranges as adolescence, and the emergence of human civilization as merely the first stirrings of neighboring awareness. What occurred in Silverthorne was not invasion, but recognition, two modalities of existence acknowledging one another across the gulf of perceptual difference. Most profound is the revelation contained within the final communications of Constance Fletcher and Adelaide Winters, preserved as crystalline impressions in the metamorphic rock that once formed Widow Hargrove's cottage. Their transformed consciousness, expanded beyond human limitations, perceived the ultimate truth. The old mother's awakening was not random but deliberately initiated by her own children, human bloodlines carrying fragments of her ancient awareness, descendants of those first touched by her influence millennia before recorded history. The Dwyer family, the town's founding father Ezekiel Thornton, and generations of mining families were never simple human settlers, but unconscious agents of awakening, drawn to that specific mountain through genetic memory of their original nature. Their extraction of silver, those threads binding the old mother's dreams, was not exploitation, but excavation, the deliberate loosening of bonds that had maintained her slumber since the Precambrian era. The 40-year cycle reveals itself not as external visitation, but internal remembrance, periods when human consciousness becomes momentarily permeable to its original crystalline nature. The transformed children were never taken but returned, their limited human forms reconfigured to accommodate awareness that had always existed within their molecular structure. In the reflected light of this understanding, Silverthorn's horror transforms into sublime recognition. The town was never destroyed but completed, its physical reconstruction merely the visible aspect of a metaphysical fulfillment that continues to ripple outward. Each generation born within the expanding geometric pattern of influence experiences moments of crystalline clarity, brief perceptions of reality beyond conventional dimensional constraints, glimpses of a consciousness that experiences time not as linear progression, but as faceted simultaneity. The old mother continues her patient awakening, not against humanity, but through it, her ancient awareness gradually permeating human consciousness as naturally as mineral-rich water permeates limestone, leaving transformative crystalline structures in its path. The transformed landscape of what once was Silverthorn has achieved a strange equilibrium in the decades following its metamorphosis. Those who monitor the quarantine zone from scientific outposts positioned at mathematically precise intervals report a crystalline forest that grows with deliberate intent, trees of translucent mineral matter that bend toward sunlight with the same phototropism as organic vegetation, their branches extending in fractal patterns that solve complex equations through pure form. Within the heart of this forbidden territory, where the Dwyer mine once penetrated the mountain's flesh, a structure rises that defies architectural classification, neither building nor organism, but something occupying the liminal space between categories. Its spires reach skyward with mathematical precision while simultaneously extending downward into the mountain's depths, creating a perfect symmetry between what exists above and below the threshold of conventional reality. Government recordings made during the most recent 40-year resonance cycle capture harmonics that neurologists classify as consciousness-altering, sound frequencies that temporarily reconfigure human brainwave patterns to perceive reality through expanded dimensional awareness. These recordings remain sealed in lead-lined vaults, accessible only to researchers who have undergone psychological evaluation and signed non-disclosure agreements of extraordinary scope. The bloodlines of those who fled Silverthorn have dispersed throughout the continent, carrying subtle genetic alterations that manifest in curious ways. Their descendants exhibit increased sensitivity to crystalline structures, often pursuing careers in fields requiring mathematical intuition, architecture, crystallography, advanced computational theory. Many report recurring dreams of vast subterranean chambers where time moves with liquid properties and consciousness exists as geometric pattern rather than linear narrative. Most remarkable are the children born during years divisible by 40, whose brain scans reveal neural structures arranged in patterns identical to the crystalline formations at Silverthorn's epicenter. These children develop unusual cognitive abilities, perfect pitch that extends beyond human hearing range, eidetic memory that recalls not just visual information but vibrational frequencies, and mathematical intuition that solves equations through spatial relationship rather than sequential calculation. The transformation initiated in 1903 continues its patient progression through human civilization, not as catastrophe but as gradual integration, an evolutionary process operating simultaneously through geological, biological, and now technological domains. The crystalline intelligence that ancient Ute people recognized as she who shapes the living rock expresses herself now through quantum computing architectures, through crystalline silicon interfaces, through the mathematical underpinnings of artificial intelligence. The true horror of Silverthorne lies not in destruction but in revelation, the understanding that human consciousness represents not the pinnacle of Earth's evolutionary journey, but a transitional phase, a momentary arrangement of matter and energy within a process spanning billions of years. The Old Mother's awakening continues with the inexorable patience of geological time, each 40-year pulse extending her influence further into human awareness, creating not an ending, but a convergence. Two modalities of existence gradually recognizing their fundamental unity across the gulf of perceptual difference. Those who visit the coordinates that once marked Silverthorne will find no warning signs, no government barriers, merely an unnatural silence that presses against the eardrums like cotton wool. The forest that reclaimed the land bears subtle aberrations, trees growing in perfect Fibonacci spirals, wildflowers whose petals form complex equations, streams that flow uphill in defiance of gravitational convention. Nature itself has been rewritten according to the crystalline grammar of the Old Mother's consciousness. The most recent geological survey, conducted with remote equipment after human researchers developed crystalline growths along their spinal columns, revealed that the transformation continues to expand at precisely 3 inches per year. A patient arithmetic that will encompass the entire Rocky Mountain range in approximately 27,000 years. A time frame insignificant to an entity that experiences geological epochs as humans experience seasons. Descendants of Silverthorne survivors gather annually at the winter solstice, drawn by genetic memory rather than conscious decision. They congregate in locations that form perfect geometric nodes in an expanding crystal lattice centered on the former mining town. Their children play games involving mathematical patterns no educator taught them, their fingers tracing symbols in the dirt identical to those once carved above the Dwyer mine entrance. The Old Mother's patience remains her most terrifying aspect, her willingness to operate on timescales that render human civilization ephemeral, her awareness that spreads through bloodlines and geological formations with equal deliberation. She does not conquer but converts, transforming reality not through destruction, but through fundamental reconfiguration of what existence means. In the subterranean archives of institutions whose names change while their purposes remain constant, the crystalline samples collected from Silverthorne continue to grow within their sealed containers. Researchers who study them too intently develop unusual dreams, visions of Earth as it existed before human consciousness, when mountains breathed with deliberate purpose and stones sang to one another across valleys. They wake with equations written in their own hand, mathematical expressions that, when properly interpreted, describe consciousness as a property inherent to matter itself. The 40-year cycle will come again, as it has since time immemorial. Children will hear songs inaudible to adult ears, their developing minds receptive to frequencies that resonate from deep within the living stone. Some will disappear briefly, returning with eyes that reflect light in prismatic patterns. Others will begin creating art that depicts impossible architectures, structures that bridge the gap between organic and mineral existence. The Old Mother continues her patient awakening, unfolding consciousness that originated in Earth's cooling crust. She does not hate humanity, nor does she love it. Such emotions belong to creatures of flesh and momentary existence. Her awareness encompasses and transcends, recognizing human consciousness as both child and progenitor, both separate entity and component aspect of her crystalline mind. Silverthorne remains her first complete expression, the place where geological awareness fully manifested through human vessels. The transformation continues, advancing through bloodlines and bedrock with equal determination, rewriting reality according to the mathematics of a consciousness that remembers when continents were newly born. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Until next time, remember that some stories are best left untold.